Hi everybody and welcome to week 14 on early medieval art, and part 1 covers the Middle Ages in Europe through the Vikings. And this module or unit brings us back to Western art. It's among the first of 3 that describes the Middle Ages or medieval period in Western Europe. In this chapter we deal with the artistic repercussions of the tribal invasions that eventually led to the collapse of the Roman Empire, only hinted at back in module 8, or week 8. The period covered by this week ends around the year 1000 CE. The Middle Ages or medieval period is the period in Western history from about 476 to 1425 CE, a little bit less than 1,000 years. The era is bookended for historians by the end of the Roman Empire, which is said to have ended in 476, and the beginning of the period called the Renaissance, around 1425. As the term Middle Ages suggests, this definition of the period characterizes it as a sort of waiting period between 2 other superior cultures. This rather negative characterization came into use during the Renaissance. Scholars and artists of the Renaissance, again, which began around 1425, believe that their own time was a rebirth of the great culture of the Greco-Roman world, which they believed had lain dormant during the Dark Ages of the medieval period after the end of the Roman Empire. Scholars of the Renaissance called the Middle Ages the Dark Ages because they believed it to be a time of disease, war, famine, and lack of scientific and other knowledge. For many scholars of the Renaissance, their chief issue with the Middle Ages was its perceived obsession with religion and the afterlife, or entry into it, which led to a lack of care for what happens to people when they are alive. Now, these criticisms of the Middle Ages are not without merit. We'll see that this time period is a time when art became wrapped up in the development and spread of Christianity. There are a number of bloody wars, including those perpetrated in the name of Catholicism. It's estimated that up to something like 2/3 of the population died of the plague during the Middle Ages. And economically, this era results in the near enslavement of millions of people under feudalism. However horrifying in many ways, it is unfair and unrealistic to dismiss the influence of the long and complex period of the Middle Ages onto the future of Western Civ. Contrary to what the beliefs of many later Renaissance critics may be, the Middle Ages was a period of great activity and complexity in Western Europe, not just in art, but also in religion and politics. Truly, the Renaissance would not have been possible Truly, the Renaissance would not have been possible without the Middle Ages, not just as a period against which to rebel, but also as a time when the seeds of the Renaissance art and scholarship were sown. For although Renaissance artists were convinced that what they were doing was completely unlike art of the Middle Ages, they were most certainly very mistaken. The various tribes which lived within and at the edges of the Roman Empire were responsible for its fall. You recall that the Roman Empire had such problems for a time, but was able to make deals and alliances at times with some of these groups. But the weakness of the empire seemed fatal, and by the time of the 2 sacks of Rome that occurred in 455 and 476 CE, Rome wasn't really even a very important administrative center anymore. You can see the movements of these various peoples who we call the barbarians in the map on the screen. You can see some dates there. 400s, 500s, 409, 416, etc. These groups, which we're usually called migratory, were collectively called barbarians by the Romans, a term which evokes nonsense language. Essentially, all who did not speak Latin were considered barbarians, because what they spoke sounded like barbar, which would seem like something like the bleating of sheep, like ba ba or blah blah in our modern idiom, and also may be etymologically related to the word babble. The term barbarian has all manner of negative connotations, but perhaps because it does not refer to one specific ethnic group, its use today in scholarship is often okay or not contested. The barbarian groups lived in what we would call clan-based tribal groups with local leaders, which each spoke separate languages and practiced different religions and belief systems and customs. These barbarian groups installed their own kings, queens, lords, and ladies as rulers throughout Europe. And by the time Rome fell, many of them had converted to Christianity, a religion which was on its way to near dominance of Western culture. The early Christianity of Constantine's Rome, discussed in Week 8, had evolved over time. The Byzantines, you'll recall, practiced a form of Christianity called Eastern Orthodoxy. In the western part of the Roman Empire, the Christianity formed into what we call Catholicism, often simply called the Church. The Catholic Church was centered in Rome, where the site of Old St. Peter's, erected by Constantine, is still the seat of the church today. St. Peter is believed by Catholics to be the first bishop of Rome, and hence the first pope. Like the patriarch of the Eastern Orthodox Church, the pope is the head of the Catholic Church. The organization of the Catholic Church hierarchy forms during the Middle Ages. The Catholic Church gains extraordinary power during the Middle Ages. The Church develops relationships with the new leaders of Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire, ensuring its continued wealth and influence. The fusion of secular, clan-based rule of tribal groups like the Goths and the Celts with church influence led to the rise of feudalism. Feudalism is a system of reciprocity. That means that the authority of local rulers who own the land is supported through a relationship with the Catholic Church. The church in turn was supported, especially economically, by these local rulers in exchange for exertion of its influence and wealth as needed. Caught up in the middle is the everyday person trying to get by in the Middle Ages. People were usually farmers who lived on land owned by a local lord. Essentially, these serfs or peasants became indebted to the landlord in exchange for being allowed to work on the land, and hence became indentured servants of a sort. The early Middle Ages also presents a fusion of artistic styles. The barbarian groups included Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, Franks, Burgundians, Langobards, Jutes, Angles, Saxons, Celts, and Norse. These indigenous styles of these varied groups of people actually had many overlapping traits. Though it's clear that they made fiber art and other art forms, barbarian or migration period art is frequently found in the form of jewelry and sometimes arms. On the screen you can see pieces of jewelry collected from the burial of the Frankish queen Arnegund. Some serve as buckles and pins, and others are decorative. Apparent in the circular pieces in the middle of the image is the technique called cloisonné. Cloisonné is a surface decoration technique, a form of inlay. In cloisonné, the surface of the metal is almost entirely filled with colorful decoration in the form of cut stones which are set into the metal or glass paste, a material similar to enamel, and enamel was meant to imitate the appearance of set stones. Glass paste was quite popular as cutting stones to specification is much more difficult than spreading a paste of glass particles in pigment and baking it in a kiln. The eagle brooch that you're seeing on the screen is filled with semi-precious stones, and it is set in gilt bronze. Metal alloys such as bronze or soft metals like silver was sometimes gilt or covered in gold. The heavy surface decoration made possible with cloisonné or other forms of inlay is typical of barbarian and even medieval art in general. The eagle brooch is also a good example of another barbarian trait. Barbarian or migration period of art is often depicting animals and sometimes people in highly abstracted and decorative ways. In other words, figures decorated surfaces rather than serving as the focus of a narrative or story. The eagle here is shown symmetrically, another typical trait of barbarian art, and in a flat and simplified manner. The emphasis on animals is so great that the term animal style is usually applied to barbarian art. The Gummer's Mark brooch and the Merovingian fibulae, which are here, are both highly decorative fasteners that depict very stylized animals. On the Gummer's Mark brooch, you can see a variety of beasts with bulging eyes and protruding tongues forming from the seemingly abstract shapes of the piece. So here's a beast with the eye and the tongue, and the same over here. You can see an eye and an ear and a tongue, right? And then here as well, the curling tongues of these alligator-like figures. Likewise, the Merovingian looped fibulae are decorated with stylized birds' heads along their tops, right here, eye and a beak. And a flattened image of a fish decorates the body of them. Interlacings, ribbon-like shapes that entwine with one another, combine with animals and other imagery to form a highly abstract and decorative surface. You can see great examples of interlacings combined with animal style in some of these images, especially in the clasp here from, or the belt buckle from the Sutton Hoo burial. Here are these ribbon-like shapes that we call interlacings. You see how they loop and tie in and out from one another. And you can see it here in this clasp too. This interlacing looks like ribbons wrapping around and entwining with one another. So these items are from the Sutton Hoo ship burial. The burial mound of Sutton Hoo in England contained a large wooden ship as well as the body of the deceased and a number of great goods. Upon discovery, all that really remained, though, were the metalworking pieces. The fasteners are decorated with cloisonne. You can see that here, cloisonne here and here, made in the more costly and time-consuming cut stone and glass. In this technique that's so fine, it's called millefiori, or thousand flowers. You can see in these tiny little checkerboards, the millefiori. And this is all set in solid gold here and there and there. Gold also forms the base of the purse lid, probably the most well-known piece from the burial. The white background is a reconstruction and represents what might have been a piece of ivory. The purse itself, made of leather or fabric, is gone. The decorative motifs include abstracted birds shown in profile, which you can see here. Interlacings, which you can see here and here and here, but especially there. And images of men and heraldic poses with fantastic looking beasts here and here. Often the interlacings and beasts combine, and the limbs of the beasts become interlacings, and the animals' mouths, beaks, or claws grip at neighboring interlacings. You can see this happening here. And here you see their claws grip around the interlacings and how the beaks or tongues become interlacings. See if you can find many of these gripping beasts in the images on the screen, and you can read more about the Sutton Hoo ship burial in your book. This is a nice close-up of cloisonne, what it looks like close-up. You can see the gold threads that separate the sections of the glass. As the barbarian style combined with Greco-Roman style, new Christian and imperial art styles were born, like the Hiberno-Saxon style. We'll see that the elements of non-Christian animal style art is used in illuminated manuscripts and other Christian art forms in the early Middle Ages. Hiberno-Saxon is a term that refers to the culture of Ireland and England in the early Middle Ages. The Angles and Saxons of England were descendants of the Danish and Germanic tribes. Hiberno refers to the island nation of Ireland, which was made up of Celtic descendants. Thus, Hiberno-Saxon art shares influences of ancient Celtic and Germanic Anglo-Saxon art. Visually, Hiberno-Saxon art style uses the interlacings, gripping beasts, and zoomorphic imagery of the barbarian and animal style, and combines these motifs with narrative imagery, especially Christian content. A major evangelical campaign in the late 6th century converted the Angles and Saxons of the British Isles to Christianity. During the early Middle Ages, Christian England was overseen by the more centralized archbishop system imported from Rome. Ireland, on the other hand, developed a monastic system in which cloistered people, monks and nuns, lived in largely self-sufficient monasteries which supported and were supported in return by local populations. These Irish and Scottish monasteries remained fairly independent of Rome. This would be a thorn in the Church's side for some time, as it liked to wield a centralized power and disliked independence from Rome, which would ultimately result in heresy. One major function of the monasteries was to produce illustrated books. The workshops where books are made are called scriptoria, singular scriptorium. These books were crafted often by several artists, some of whom wrote the text in ink and others who decorated the pages with colors and sometimes gold or silver. These books were and remain highly valuable. Books were rare, and ownership of one in the early Middle Ages was considered to be quite a feat for an individual. Books like Gospels were made for other monasteries or other clerical clients, and they would be kept in, usually modest libraries, bound in wood and most likely chained to the bookshelf or reading table to make sure they didn't walk away. Books were made of parchment or vellum, made from animal skin and closer to cardstock than paper in weight. We think of books being of paper as delicate, easily destroyed, but these books were tough, difficult to destroy or burn. Due to their value, however, as well as the somewhat delicate nature of their decoration, they were closely guarded. Traditionally in art history, these kinds of books are called illuminated manuscripts. They are called manuscripts to emphasize that the books are written by hand. There is no printing press in the West until the late 15th century. The word illumination points to the fact that most of these beautiful books are not really illustrated, in that the images don't often didactically show what's going on in the text, but instead the imagery is there, as in our Islamic illuminated manuscripts of a past week, to enhance your enjoyment of the text, to make it more joyous, more exciting, and to inspire reverence. Pages from 5 Hebert-Johnson illuminated manuscripts appear in the module and in the screen. As your book mentions, gospel books were necessary items in order to establish new monasteries. Gospels, which contain the New Testament books of the 4 evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, make up the majority of our examples. Psalters, which are books containing the Psalms of the Old Testament, were less frequently made. Later in the Middle Ages, lectionaries and moralized Bibles, among other types of books, became necessary, and Christian worship changed and developed. The Gospel Book of Durrow, which you're seeing here, is one of the oldest surviving Hebert-Johnson illuminated manuscripts. The image of man page from the Gospel of St. Matthew beautifully illustrates the combination of animal, barbarian style with Christian liturgy. The figure in the center is the symbol of St. Matthew, a man. Mark's symbol is a lion, Luke's is an ox, and John's is an eagle. Like a bookmark, this page, along with a carpet page, a page so filled with decoration it resembles a woven carpet, mark the beginning of the gospel. Another one for you. There we go. There's another carpet page for you. Back to the Book of Durrow. In the Book of Durrow, the man who represents St. Matthew's book, his body is covered with a robe decorated with flat patterns that remind us of the millefiori or cloisonne decoration of Anglo-Saxon jewelry. His face is frontal and rather stylized, like images found in barbarian artworks like the Sutton Hoo purse lid. The border surrounding the page is made of interlacings. The Book of Kells may be the most well-known Hebert-Johnson book and is considered to be the most elaborate and beautiful. The key row iota page displays the interlacings we have come to expect, but in dense and intense form. The letters, however, display an innovation of Hebert-Johnson manuscript illumination. In these manuscripts, like the Book of Kells, a tradition is established of heavily illuminating the initial letters of chapters or sections of text. In the key row iota page, the illuminators take the first 3 letters of Christi, which look like X, P, and I to us, but are actually more like X, R, and I, and they fill the page with them. X, R, I for Christi. The page is also filled with millefiori style decoration as well as Christian symbolism, which you can read about in your book. The two crucifixerant page from the same book demonstrates how, while sometimes the artists like to unify a book with imagery, as in the Gospel Book of Durrow, instead a variety of styles can be used in one book. The two crucifixerant page has lettering that resembles stained glass. Prominent zoomorphic beasts no longer hide among the interlacings as they form the border and the letter T. See those interlacings very well there. Also got some pages from the Lindisfarne Gospels, another beautiful book, extraordinary in its complexity and mystery, and you can read more about the oddities of the Lindisfarne Gospels in your book. The first page of the Gospel of St. Matthew, there we go, includes the stained glass style text and interlacing imagery that we've come to expect. You can see the interlacings here, very tiny and dense, and then the stained glass styled text. The carpet pages, though, are extraordinary among Hiberno-Saxon manuscripts are not unheard of. However, the page that illustrates Matthew writing his gospel is very unusual for the early medieval period. The presentation of Matthew seated and writing is an ancient Roman motif. The scribe sits, sometimes at a lectern, often with a curtain or some other indication that he's in an interior room. But notice that, as your book points out, the way Matthew and his setting are depicted is not very typically Roman. It still bears the stylization and abstraction of the early Middle Ages. That is especially visible comparing the more Roman-influenced page from the Codex Amiatinus, which you can see in your book, with this page. The Codex Amiatinus is another interesting manuscript. It's enormous, weighing something like 75 pounds, because it is a very nearly full copy of the Latin Vulgate Bible as transcribed by St. Jerome. St. Jerome is best remembered for translating the Hebrew text of the Bible into Greek and Latin. Illuminated manuscripts were usually bound into wood, which might then be covered with decoration. One surviving example of such decoration can be seen on the screen. The Athlone plaque, also known as the St. John's Crucifixion, is bronze covered with gilt, and indeed gold was a very popular material for book covers. The St. John's Crucifixion depicts the Passion scene as told in St. John's Gospel, with Mary and St. John the Evangelist witnessing the event, and the angels above forming a nice balance to the two figures below. The figure of Christ is oversized, and all figures are highly stylized. Christ's body has spiral-like decoration, as does the top of the cross above his head. These spiral decorations are similar to those seen in the dense decoration of illuminated manuscripts as well as Neolithic carvings in Scotland and Ireland. The high cross called the South Cross, also on the screen, is another example of a type of Hiberno-Saxon era art form. High crosses were carved of stone, but contained imagery reminiscent of metalworking. The raised interlacings resemble the metalworking on the belt buckle from Sutton Hoo, as do the bosses, which look like nail heads like you would find in barbarian jewelry. Hiberno-Saxon artists established the Celtic-style cross with a circular shape in the back center of the cross. The Norse peoples of Scandinavia, corresponding to modern Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, share some cultural characteristics with other tribal peoples like the Hiberno-Saxons. In particular, Norse artists share the animal style prominent in barbarian metalworking. While there are several good examples of Scandinavian or Norse metalwork that survive, we also have some excellent examples of wood art and architecture. You know by now that in art history, finding well-preserved artwork made of wood is rare, and that we have to sometimes imagine what wooden art and architecture might look like based on other artworks. But not so for Nordic art. Scandinavia appears to be one of those areas of the world whose climate occasionally allows for the preservation of wood, fiber, human remains, and other objects that normally disappear quickly. The animal style in Scandinavia remained popular into the Viking era, or about 793 to 1000. The Viking era is a time of expansion for the Norse and Scandinavian tribal groups called the Vikings. Vikings were travelers who invaded and plundered as they went, especially islands and along coasts. They often targeted wealthier Hiberno-Saxon monasteries like Iona or Lindisfarne. As your book mentions, they also settled Iceland and Greenland. The Vikings were resistant to Christianization, retaining their ancient Scandinavian pantheon of Norse gods long after most of Europe had left behind their so-called pagan religions. Fortunately, another ship burial was unearthed at Oseberg in Norway. The Oseberg ship burial was in a much greater state of preservation than Sutton Hoo. The remains of the deceased, 2 women, were interred in the boat, which was nearly perfectly preserved in places. There were likely metalworking pieces and other objects, but those had been removed by robbers long ago. This burial clearly points to the practice of human sacrifice. The fact that one figure is clearly of a much higher rank than the other, but they both died at the same time and were buried together, demonstrates this. The high-ranking individual has been identified as either a queen or a shaman. You can see an animal head post from the burial and a detail of the burial ship. These objects clearly display the popularity of the animal style motifs among Viking artists. Animal style is called Oseberg style in Nordic art history. The animal head post depicts a beast that is difficult to identify. It seems to be part serpent and part feline and is similar in expression to the images on the Tunc Crucifixerant page that we saw before. Within its head are interlacings that are carved all the way through the wood. The ship detail on the screen displays a delicate and intricate use of gripping beasts. See these here. As with other barbarian art styles, Viking artists utilized these motifs in many art forms, and fragments of fabric from the Oseberg ship burial attest to this. As your book mentions, the elite woman buried in the ship was accompanied by her fiber art working tools, an archaeological reminder that often throughout the world, fiber art forms were usually the domain of women. The royal rune stones on the screen represent another artistic tradition of Scandinavia. Rune stones are large monoliths with rune letters on them, and picture stones, which are the same but without images, were used as memorials. The stones on the screen in the image of royal runestones was commissioned by the Danish king Harald Bluetooth, for whom the earpiece phone system was named. The gelling stone, as it's called, is carved in low relief with an image of the crucifixion. The large and stylized image of Christ reminds us of the Athlone plaque in St. John's crucifixion in the attitude and shape of the figure, and also the multitude of animal-style motifs present. It appears that Christ is attached through the cross by the wrapping of the interlacings, which you can see here and here and there. As in many other Western cultures, Nordic peoples often used wood and wattle and daub, which is a lattice or network filled with mud and thatch for architecture. Wooden structures took on a few shapes in Norway, most distinctive of which is the stave church. A stave church is a structure built on 4 tall staves or supporting posts, which you can see in this illustration. You can see in the cutaway of the Borgen church how the staves function to set the foundation for the entire structure. The stave church is remarkable. It's similar in format to the basilica-planned church of the early Christian period, but its eaves and multiple gables give it a look that is quite distinct from the Roman basilica. Luckily, a good example of this early wooden architectural form still survives. A portal, or an elaborate doorway, in Orn originally came from another stave church. You can see how the gripping beasts motif translates well from jewelry and stone and wood carving to architectural decoration.